Hi, and welcome to a very short introduction. From ancient Greece to branding, globalisation to Homer, and logic to fashion, we'll showcase a concise and dynamic insight into a range of diverse topics for wherever your curiosity may lead you. So here is today's very short introduction.
Hello to everybody out there listening to this blog, wherever you are in the world. My name is Graham Priest, and I'm an Anglo-Australian philosopher. I started life as a mathematician, but for most of my academic life, I've worked in philosophy departments. And although originally the thing that interested me most in philosophy was logic, we'll come back to that in a second, nowadays I'm interested in most parts of philosophy. Philosophy is a rich and deep subject, a fascinating subject. I've worked and taught in a number of universities in the UK and Australia, and my current position is in the United States. So I'm a professor at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, which is where essentially I'm talking to you from. So quite a long time ago, OUP asked me to write the VSI on logic. I really like the VSI series. I mean, I've read several of them, and the present volume aside, I think that they do a great job of introducing people to interesting areas. The volume on logic came out in 2000. We went into a second edition in 2017, and I've lost count of the number of languages it's been translated into, but at the last count, it was something like a dozen languages other than English. So what I'm going to do in the rest of this podcast is talk a little bit about logic, what makes it interesting, and what interests me in particular. So let's start with a question of what logic is. And there's an easy and quick answer to that question, which is that logic is about reasoning. So reasoning is something that we all do. We reason from things we know to be true to figure out things we don't know. We reason from things we believe to show they might have consequences we don't accept, and so we shouldn't believe them. We reason with ourselves, we reason with friends and others, we reason to try to persuade them of things, we reason to try persuading they're wrong sometimes. And this is reasoning, and logic is the subject which studies reasoning. Now you have to hear that in a particular way, because you might well misunderstand what I've just said. Logic is not about the way that people actually reason. That is a subject that belongs to cognitive psychology. And one thing we know from studies in cognitive psychology is that people reason very badly a lot of the time. And it's not just that they're confused or drunk or whatever, but people make systematic mistakes in reasoning. There's quite a large literature on this in cognitive psychology. So logic is not about how people actually reason, but how people should reason. If you like, it's about the norms of reasoning. So logic studies good reasoning, what reasoning is good, and why. Now, the second thing you have to understand about what I mean by reasoning is this. When you reason, you start from somewhere. Logicians call these premises, and then you make conclusions. Logic is not concerned with the premises. That's someone else's problem. Logic is concerned with what really follows from premises. So if you tell me a bunch of facts, or a bunch of beliefs or claims, then I, as a logician, will tell you what follows from these or what doesn't follow from these. So logicians call what follows from what validity. So logicians study validity. It studies what follows from what and why. So as I say, logic is the study of reasoning, but it's the study of the norms of reasoning, not the psychology of reasoning. And the reasoning that a logician is concerned with are not the premises, but what follows from whatever premises you have. That may or may not sound terribly interesting. Let me say a little bit more about logic to explain why it's interesting and important. First of all, logic is a very ancient subject. The origins of logic in the West go back to ancient Greece, with philosophers such as Aristotle and philosophers such as the Stoics. So we're talking about the 4th, 5th century BCE. In the East, it goes back to a group of logicians called the Nyaya. We don't know their exact origin, but they're sometime around the turn of the Common Era. So logic has been studied for a very long time, and it has a rich and deep history. It's been progressing now for 2,000 years, but something very significant happened around the turn of the 20th century when logicians really started to take the tools of mathematics that were then being delivered, such as algebraicization and so on, and apply them to logic for the first time. And this caused a revolution in logic. It made logic a subject of power and depth that had not been achieved before, with significant consequences. So one of these was laying the theory of computation, a long time before practical computers were developed. So modern logic has important consequences in very practical areas. So logic is a subject which is both very ancient and very modern, and it has a fascinating history, which is another matter. Why should one be interested in logic if one's not a logician? We all reason, everybody reasons, and you don't have to study logic to be a good reasoner. Many people reason well, naturally, and lots of reasoning uses principles that are pretty obvious. Socrates is human, all humans are mortal, so Socrates is mortal. No one's going to argue about that. But reasoning often gets very complicated and difficult, particularly in areas such as mathematics and philosophy and the law. Chains of reasoning can be very complex. Many, many different premises may be involved, and many ways they can be chained together in complex ways. So when the going gets tough in reasoning, that's when I think logic becomes really useful, not as a theoretical enterprise in its own right, but as a practical enterprise. This is one reason why people are interested in logic. Another reason why people are interested in logic is that logic actually has roots which sink deep into philosophy. So it's no accident that logic is studied in philosophy departments. Nowadays it's studied in mathematics departments and computer science departments as well, but it's always had an important home in logic. And this is not just because philosophers reason. They do, of course, on a good day. Rather, logic is concerned with what follows from what and why. And the why question is important, because once you start to look at the why question, you soon sink deep into questions of the nature of reality, metaphysics, if you want to call it that. The roots of logic sink deep into philosophical questions, and those philosophical questions, in turn, affect the logical theories that eventuate. So I'll give you some examples of that in a moment, but let me just flag this as another reason why logic is an important subject, because it's not simply about reasoning. Its roots sink deep into deep philosophical questions. The last thing I'll talk about is why I got interested in logic. Since my background is in mathematics, I guess the first thing that interested me about logic was some of the technical stuff. So there are many interesting technical questions, mathematical questions in logic, and with my mathematical background, I was naturally interested in those. But once I studied more and more logic, I came to appreciate the connections between logic and the rest of philosophy and these kind of deep metaphysical questions that I talked about. Indeed, when I wrote the VSI in logic, when I was asked to do this, I said, no, this is impossible. You can't introduce logic in 50,000 words. And the editor at the time said to me, well, look, why don't you think of it like this? Take some philosophical problems and explain the relevance of logic to these, and you can explain some techniques of logic along the way. And she was right. It was a very good suggestion. So that's the way I wrote the VSI. Now, what sorts of problems does logic sink its roots into? Well, there are so many, but there are questions about God, for example. There are questions about time and change, truth and existence, language and paradox. So these are all deep metaphysical or philosophical issues. And one thing I do in the VSI is explore the connections between logic and some of these issues. And as I say, what I love about logic personally, apart from the fact that it can prove a few theorems, is the fact that it has these deep connections with profound philosophical questions. Okay, this is not the time or the place to go into those questions further. If you want to see what they are and their relationship to logic, then I'm afraid you're going to have to buy the book.